The FIA has opened up another very interesting topic for discussion weeks before the beginning of the summer break, the budget cap for 2022. And it seems like many teams have failed in respecting the $140 million spending restriction. Considering the fact that the current champions Red Bull have been massively criticised for gaining an illegal advantage, which is believed to origin thanks to the fact that they've spent more than the $145 million allowance in 2021, the restrictions now are likely to be more severe, and these teams will see their future being absolutely changed for the worst. Join us as we go through the alleged breach of the 2022 budget cap, the penalties that will be applied to the teams, as well as whether or not this will change the pecking order for the upcoming season. The FIA introduced the budget cap back in 2021 in order to try and bring the gap between the lower performing teams to the top dogs closer. While we're seeing a much closer competition right now, with everyone not named Max Verstappen changing places frequently from P2 to P10, it's still not enough because there are just 2 race winners in the first 10 venues. This is very likely to change with the next regulations in 2026, but until then, we're led to believe that the domination of Red Bull will continue, and Verstappen will get as many titles as possible without any real challenge whatsoever. But that was until a couple of days ago, before the FIA announced that there are multiple teams which are being closely investigated for breaching the budget cap in 2022. The financial sacred rule doesn't seem to be respected that much from the teams as originally believed, and although Aston Martin and Red Bull's breaches was something that shattered the hope of a fair play in Formula 1, because they're now the top teams on the grid with Mercedes in between, there is still hope for the sport. Before we go into the alleged breaches, let's talk about whether or not these claims hold water, and why would a team try to go in a different direction of breaching the budget cap and face the sporting penalties in a time when there's already a lot of restriction on the technical aspects of the car. For starters, we don't have to go that much further and just look at the gains that Red Bull and Aston Martin made in the previous season. I'm not blaming the budget cap breach directly for their success, especially not for Aston Martin, because they brought a very experienced staff from Red Bull and have started the season with Dan Fallows as their new technical director, as he served the role as the chief aerodynamicist in Red Bull prior to this. But in a time where the technical regulations are so strictly regulated, how does a team jump from P7 to a potential fight for P2 in the Constructors' Championship in the matter of a couple of months? Their breach was nowhere near what Red Bull caused, as the Austrian team has reportedly spent somewhere between $400,000 to $1.4 million on the catering budget, a cause that will still raise some eyebrows throughout the paddock because the penalty given to them was a $7 million fine and 10% reducing of the time spent in the aerodynamic facilities. But McLaren gains in the last 2 races have showed that there is potential hidden in the cars for those teams not named Red Bull, so it might be the budget cap breach that caused Aston Martin's excellent uprise in form. Regardless, one fact remains as it is. There are not many teams out there that could cause breach to the budget cap because, just like I said, there aren't that many teams able to spend $140 million in a season. So whenever a breach is mentioned in the topics, the attention always goes to teams like Red Bull, Aston Martin, Ferrari and Mercedes, because they're the ones that have the most potential of going over the limit in a desperate try to gain more advantage in a season that's already limiting their creativity and financial freedom to the maximum point. And even if they are proven to be guilty, what would be a worthy penalty for them? To this day, we're still hearing messages from Ferrari's camp about how unfair Red Bull penalty has been, but considering the fact that it was the first breach of this nature, the FIA couldn't have anticipated whether the given penalty would be harsh enough to scare everyone from breaching the budget cap, or if it would have the effect that it did right now, more and more teams being related to breaching the budget cap. Gaining an advantage from breaching the budget cap is definitely the most desperate and worst thing an F1 team could reach for, but desperate times call for desperate measures, and one couldn't help but absolutely understand the tries of Mercedes, Ferrari and Aston Martin to try and be the better team out there, with Wolff publicly announcing that his team would keep $7 million in reserve just in case if Red Bull's penalty doesn't affect the performance of the RB19 for as much as he feels is deserved. Be that as it may, Red Bull's advantage is uncatchable at this moment, and there's nothing that the other teams can do other than sit back and wait for Verstappen to clinch his championship as early as in Zandvoort, his home race. While this fact is a little depressing, the reality remains as it is. 3 teams are now under investigation for breaching the budget cap in 2022, and this has been confirmed by the FIA. So, what are the penalties coming towards the teams that have potentially caused a breach of this sacred rule in F1? Stefano Domenicali has spoken about what the team should face if found guilty of breaching the budget cap, and according to the president of the sport, sporting penalties should be the only repercussion given, and they should be enlarged a bit as a compensation for missing out on the financial fines. Obviously, everything that is related with money is easy to be earned and paid from F1 teams, but if you have reduced time in the wind tunnels and the CFD factories, you ought to think wisely about how you'll spend this time and whether or not you're going to think about breaching the budget cap yet again. Of course, there's always the exception of Red Bull, because from what we can see, they've been able to build a car that no other constructor can match, and that makes up for the entirety of the boredom-filled season that we're currently witnessing. But as I mentioned earlier in this video, if we're to look at every team and driver below Verstappen, the order is constantly changing, and that means one thing: the technical regulations, in a combination with the budget cap penalty, works wonders. And if you want to keep it that way, penalising teams in terms of track-related performance is the only logical thing to do at this point. Domenicali went on to elaborate on this further as he said, "Control is in the hands of the FIA. Personally, what I have asked is to anticipate as soon as possible the publications of the investigations made by the staff of the FIA. I hope it can do as soon as possible, but I say this only because in this way it does not give rise to speculation and comments that are not good for anyone." Definitely, it would hurt the teams much more if his wishes are to come true. But now the sport faces yet another dilemma. Is the budget cap actually working, and how should they implement the success of this measurement even further? For starters, not every team has $140 million to spend, or $135 million for the current season, and while shedding it down $5 million every year has helped in closing the gap between the midfield and seeing teams like McLaren make a sudden surge, it's not enough in terms of having a very competitive championship. And if you are asking us if the budget cap is working, there's a very interesting answer to this question: both yes and no. For example, Mercedes' main reason for not catching up to Red Bull has been pinpointed to the budget cap limitation that does not allow them to spend a certain amount of money in making the car greater. But if you ask Red Bull, spending those extra money in catering has nothing to do with how their car performs right now, which only prompts other teams to try and become like Red Bull and follow in their footsteps. But we must not take credit away from the Austrian team, because we've seen how complex their car looks, and in a vastly restricted technical regulation era like the one we're witnessing right now, the dominance of Verstappen is nothing that needs to be disputed. We've seen Perez struggling to perform with the RB19 for the majority of the season, as he missed out on 5 consecutive Q3 appearances. So, is it really the illegality of their car pushed by the agenda of breaching the budget cap? Or did Red Bull manage to utilise the very best out of Newey's mind and use it in producing a car that is absolutely flawless? What do you think about the 3 teams that have caused a breach to the budget cap? Do you think they've done it on purpose? And do you think that it's evident that this financial measurement is not respected anymore due to Red Bull's advantage? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below.